Hi, welcome. My name's Loch Kelly, and I'm really happy to be here today. I'm going to be talking a little bit about effortless mindfulness and awakening approach. So I'm doing this webinar with Dick Schwartz, and the two of us have found that we have much in common. I have been involved with both psychotherapy and meditation from a young age. I actually had a early start in sports. I felt like I would enter this zone or this flow where I felt like I could literally shift into an embodied, awake, interconnected way of being that felt so different than the usual chattering mind. So that was kind of my introduction. And then I would started to be able to access that intentionally in other areas of my life, just by walking in the woods, by doing things with my friends and playing. And eventually, I had a series of losses in my life. I had my father who developed brain cancer, and a friend of mine died in a car accident. Right afterwards, my father passed away from cancer, and then my grandmother, who lived with us, also passed away in a short amount of time. I was at college and felt tremendous grief. I tried to talk to other people, therapists, counselors, teachers, professors, friends, but didn't seem to get relief. But one evening, walking out of the library, I felt like there was this other part of me that spoke and said, I don't know if you can take this much longer. And interestingly, what I did was I felt like I looked back or turned my awareness back to look for who was talking or where that was coming from. And interestingly, what happened was it was almost as if my awareness looked through that voice and opened up out of myself into the beautiful winter night sky. And I felt like my consciousness expanded, my heavy burden of carrying this grief opened to a greater support, to a greater interconnection with the nature all around, and with as big as the universe, looking out at this beautiful night sky with these stars. And I felt not only that I had opened out, but I felt a kind of support and relief and a interconnection and a dimension of myself that was greater than this small sense of self. I started to laugh and cry at the same time. It felt like, oh my God, what is this? Who is this? What's going on here? And interestingly, even though I had some interest in exploring religions, I felt like, well, this is a dimension of my human consciousness. This is something greater. But I felt like I started to read different books and study different traditions and learn different methods to return to this. The grief continued. It actually was able to process in a more natural way with this greater sense of self being available to love parts both from the current grief and from unprocessed childhood trauma and feelings of both abandonment and feeling of a sense of other losses. So that kind of started me off on this journey to explore. Being in college, I remember saying to myself, okay, so when people would say, what are you going to do with your life? I thought of this and I said, whatever that is, that's what I want to do. I want to find out what this is, how to access it, how to live from here. And so this has taken me forward. And I think, interestingly, I had this kind of educational democratic, scientific approach to it that was very experiential. So I went around the world and read much of the literature, and at that time and recently, a lot of the great contemplative texts from East and West have been translated from their original languages. And I was able to study with some of the great meditation, contemplative teachers, and befriend and eventually do many retreats and studies. But what I did is, after going on a fellowship to Sri Lanka, India, and Nepal, and doing certain retreats, meeting teachers, I met, I had done a lot of mindfulness meditation in Sri Lanka for 9 months. And then I went up and met the Dalai Lama, who happened to just come back from France, where he had taught what's called Dzogchen, which is a direct path tradition of Tibetan Buddhism. And after hearing his talk, I was inspired, raised my hand, and said, who should I go study with? He pointed me to this fellow in Nepal, Toka Urgyen Rinpoche. And Toka Urgyen had been giving out these kind of direct pointing instructions to how to recognize your true nature, or the self, or Buddha nature, or essential mind. And I went off there and met him, and within a couple days, he had given me a couple pointing out instructions, which basically are ways of turning awareness around, or unhooking, or asking parts for space is one way to do that. And there are other ways to open and include, similarly to the way I had had that initial experience. But now I could intentionally navigate my own consciousness in a way that contemplatives had done for many years. The interesting thing about him is that he had done three-year retreats in the Tibetan style and was very revered. But what had happened is, after three-year retreats, he told us that at 8 years old, his uncle had given him this kind of direct teaching, pointing out, and that after three-year retreats, there was no difference. That what he had gotten initially and essentially at 8 was unchanged by the learning and the efforting kinds of practices. So he's the one who defined this term, saying there are two types of mindfulness. First type is deliberate mindfulness, and second is effortless mindfulness. So I practiced some deliberate mindfulness, and much of the insight meditation, vipassana, mindfulness-based, one-pointed attention, much of mantra, yoga is devoted to kind of intentional or basic or deliberate mindfulness. And then what I'm interested in exploring and teaching, having taught both, is effortless mindfulness. And effortless mindfulness has an assumption that you don't need to develop or create this most essential, free, awake awareness that is your basic nature, but that each of us is already this, that it's just obscured or hidden by faster moving thoughts and stronger moving emotions in different parts of ourselves that sit in the seat of the self and obscure us. And if we can simply learn to make this background, foreground shift from being in this cloud of our consciousness, trying to clean it up all the time and work with parts, even psychologically, to the best of our ability, we can do some relief of a certain level of suffering. But ultimately, what I discovered is there's another kind of suffering that can only be relieved by discovering this dimension of consciousness, this essential identity that is both spacious and pervasive. It's not just a transcendent dimension, but it transcends and includes and interconnects with everyone and everything. So what I found is that there are ways to discover and uncover and directly introduce people to themselves. And that it just requires a different kind of learning. It's not that it's so esoteric or that you have to go live in a monastery or cave, that actually people during certain periods of time in many wisdom traditions discovered in the midst of daily life, and their stories of fishmongers and householders and people doing every sort of job who were able to, through this method of direct recognition and gradual unfolding, were able to discover their self, what we're calling self in this webinar. So this sense of current constellation of consciousness is there's like a group of parts or ego identities that we're looking to and forming as a way to be safe and to protect these traumatized or hurt or exiled parts. And that within that small cloud of consciousness, there is a limited dimension of healing and liberation and unburdening that can be done. But when we access self, either initially or eventually when you clear a certain amount away, it will show up more. And at some sense, it's not just about the healing, but it's also about living from this, that it's actually the essential identity. And that most of us have glimpsed this, whether we've meditated or not. And many people actually do what they do for pleasure or for their hobby or in their free time to access a sense of freedom from the chattering mind, a sense of embodied well-being or ease, a sense of natural flow, what's called a flow state, or being in the zone is similar to what I'm talking about in effortless mindfulness. There is this feeling of panoramic, embodied interconnectedness in the now. And there's a silence that is dynamic, a space that's boundless and within. And not only being aware of that space, but just being curious as you become aware of the spacious awareness of whether it's possible that you're actually aware from that spacious awareness, which is all around and within, and is arising as a dynamic field of interconnected, unconditional love is what it feels like, well-being. And these are not states, that this feeling actually is the natural condition, is the source of our mind from which thoughts appear and sensations and pleasant and unpleasant conditions, and from which these hurt or exiled parts can be loved and listened to and unburdened. So one of the practices of awakening is to do a practice like IFS, to do work directly with parts during the week, during each day, if possible, Another is really to discover how to relate to other people, and how to relate to work and activity in the world, so that you shift from kind of a thought-based way of knowing to an awareness-based way of knowing to a heart, mind operating system. So it feels like you've dropped from head to heart. And the heart is your heart mind. It's not your emotional heart. Subtler, and it opens behind you and connects almost as if you're seeing through the eyes of the heart. And the feeling of heart mind is one where you feel connected to everyone and feel a sense of safety and well-being. And this is not a blissful state, but actually what we usually walk around in when we're more parts-led is the altered state. And that rather than trying to just improve the ego functioning and ego identity and become a functional adult or have a meditative experience, that can only relax and calm our parts to some degree. But the great radical possibility that's available, I've found more and more as I've lived and learned and shared and seen many, many people, thousands of people, shift from thought-based to awareness-based to open-hearted, heart-mind-based ways of living, and then from there, greater capacity to live and love your parts and live in love with the parts of other people and the different situations in the world, so that there's actually a better motivation for activity, social justice, courage, and action. So this effortless mindfulness is discovering the subtlest dimension of our awareness, which has eluded us, but it's because we haven't known how to know it, is really the main thing. We've tried to know it with thought, with activity, with achievement, with even effort of sitting long meditation practices. And there's one interesting teaching from one of the Tibetan traditions which answers the question, if it's natural, why haven't we discovered it? And the 4 reasons given are, it's so close, we can't see it. It's so close, it's as close as our breath, and we're actually looking from it. The second one is, it's so non-conceptual that we can't understand it. So we have to feel it, almost like riding a bicycle. Awareness has to know itself as the primary dimension. And it's so simple once we realize that it's just awareness that's the source of self. So simple when you get a relief. It's not big fireworks. It's not this godlike experience. What it is you without the anxiety, worry, fear, and shame. Those shameful parts are now loved and included. And so you are this dimension of your being that is your essential nature, that has a quality of huge capacity for love. So simple, we can't believe it. And then the 4th reason given is, it's so good that it's hard to accept. it's so good that it's you, that this self is really who you are, that who you are is not bad or worthless or mistaken or damaged or sinful or stupid or imperfect, that this basic goodness, this okayness, this well-being, this essential, effortless awareness is who you have always been, essentially, to which you, it includes all the bumbling parts of you and all the feelings of shame and guilt and worry and fear that then you can include and respond to and respond from a new ground of being. So it's really quite remarkable that my main work has been to make this simple and elegant and available, and to really do the research both in the latest neuroscience research, which I've done, and I'll be sharing some of that with you, and to do the research of what's real, what's true, in terms of the experience of students and how it works and how we're not kidding ourselves and we're able to be in relationships in the world from this, and really researching how this actually affects everyone else in our community and in the world, and what effect it has when people shift and awaken, not only awaken to this awareness, but then having the awareness embodied, open-hearted, and relating to everyone and everything. So also feeling that there is a sense of simplicity, that this is available, and that the constellation of our consciousness as we've developmentally framed it and as we've culturally framed it, there's some sort of shift to that feels like a disorientation before there's a reorientation. There can be some feeling of a rebound effect, or some parts that have been protectors will feel like they don't know the self, so that we bring the self to the protectors, and we let all our parts know from the same premise that all parts are welcome and there are no bad parts, and let them know we're not going to replace them or kill them or fight with them or exile them, but we're just going to shift, ask for some space, or shift to notice the space that's awake. And the reason we're doing this is to come back to listen and love. So there's some shift to a new dimension, but the uniqueness of this process, as I've discovered it and am practicing it and teaching it, is we don't spend a lot of time in the gap of deconstructing the ego and remaining in kind of a no ego, no self, or spend a lot of time in this kind of witness consciousness where we're detached, nor spend a lot of time in the first level of shamatha or calm abiding, where we kind of repress one part of our brain's functioning and go into kind of a sauna meditation where we're comfortably numb but can't quite function from there, nor spend a lot of time in kind of a meditative witness, which is slightly detached. These are traditional initial phases of meditation training that we can play with. But when we discover that we can ask for some space, and then we realize that space is actually awake, and that discovery of the awake, loving self-energy that has its source in this interconnected, open, boundless, timeless, invisible, empty, awake, already here without our help, all at onceness, that is none other than who we are, that it is intermingled and arising as this ocean of awareness that's arising as this wave of who we are and who you are. And we have this same effortless, awake presence that's arising as this unique, bumbling, goofy, imperfect human being who's living and learning. And that holding that discovery of this already supportive nature is what effortless mindfulness discovers, so that we discover the self, and the self discovers the parts, and the self within the parts, in a way that there's a realization or an untying of these knots of resistance from the consciousness, so that there is actually more access to include and welcome the parts any way that they are, as upset or angry or closed down or scared, are more available when we have made a decision, just as we make a decision to do an IFS session, to access self in order to live and love more fully. And amazingly, this glimpse practices, which is the method of effortless mindfulness, are done fairly quickly and fully and thoroughly. It's almost like riding a bicycle. You feel it, it's not an intellectual thing, but it's a shift and an inclusion. And just like riding a bicycle, you have to prepare, and you can only understand so much. But then in order to ride, you have to get on and go fairly quickly. And so there's some recognition and then realization where you abide. But then as you abide, even for a few seconds, just like riding a bicycle, you can start to include listening, sensation, notice thoughts, your breath, without reforming a manager within your system. So the figure ground shift happens, and then my experience is you don't need to spend more than 3 seconds to 3 minutes in this empty, awake, pure awareness. As soon as it recognizes itself as the ground, what's here already without your help, then there's a noticing and including of the energetic, interconnected dimension, which is non-threatening and is more of a dance that includes thoughts, sensations, breath, and eventually speech, walking, talking, without losing the new ground of being the new self, so that we move from self-essence, which is the pure awareness, to self-energy, to this embodied self that's embodied everywhere here and interconnected, and then self-leadership, where we are able to walk and talk, have courage and competent compassion, and begin to create and relate. So I look forward to sharing more with you about effortless mindfulness and awakening, and to say that I believe that awakening is the next natural stage of human development. I believe it's possible and more available than is commonly believed, and especially in this contemporary age where we have resources to work with the parts and exiles that often will bring us back to more part-related protective ways. So this is one of the reasons working with Dick and IFS community, as well as the awakening community and my other colleagues in the world of science and everywhere, because it's a great world and universe, and I'm glad we're all here together. So I look forward to meeting you on this journey and sharing further and hearing from you. And may you be well and happy and honest and open and willing. Thank you so much.